There is always an interesting question to ask as we go forward, whether things are going to be the same, and one of the ways in which they may be different would be the question of whether or not there will or will not be the same species included in our collections. The first in our series is a talk by Catherine Doyle, who will ask about whether or not some species don't belong in the zoo. Catherine is the Elephant Campaign Director for the Defense of Animals, an advocate of elephants in zoos and circuses. She's been in the animal protection profession for more than 13 years, and the last 9 years devoted entirely to working on the health and welfare of management of elephants. She's presented expert testimony on numerous government hearings and has appeared as media spokesman on television, radio, and print worldwide. She's an active fundraiser for elephant conservation in Africa and Asia and has been very successful in that regard. On top of everything else, I'm also proud to say Catherine is a graduate student at Canisius College. Catherine Doyle.
Okay, so entertaining slide on the future. That's what we're here to talk about. And also, a lot of the talk so far has been about kind of the physical future of zoos. And what I'm going to be approaching more is the future of our thinking, not about zoos, but about the individuals that we keep in zoos, and hopefully looking more closely at the realities of their lives. So in the future, I think we're going to see a different selection of species offered for public display in zoos and aquariums. And I'm going to argue that the selection will be based on the recognition that the scientifically established natures of some non-human animals, such as orcas, elephants, and chimpanzees, makes their captivity untenable, and that a greater recognition of the blurred lines between our natures and those of other species will result in these individuals no longer being held in zoos and marine parks. It was 140 years ago that Charles Darwin wrote The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, in which he attributed a range of emotions to what he called the lower animals, and that included affection, anger, astonishment, and terror. Yet only now are we really embracing the concept of animal emotions at the scientific level and among the general populace. But animal emotions are just one blurring the lines between humans and non-humans. Today, the average person on the street takes it for granted that elephants mourn their dead, and recent science has illuminated us and the public about laughter in chimpanzees and rats, tool use in mammals, birds, and fish, and cooperative problem solving, as we've heard earlier, and self-awareness in elephants. Even elementary school children know about the elephant Coco and her love for a kitten, and they can relate to that. They can relate for her feelings, and it's something that goes beyond species lines. At the same time, though, we celebrate the similarities between non-human animals and ourselves. We use their differences as justification for caging them in zoos and aquariums and to put them on display for human interest and entertainment. This often harms them physically and psychologically, not their intentional actions, but by confining them in conditions that do not meet their complex needs. But maybe as important, we limit the potential for what these individuals can become, and their lives, in fact, become defined by captivity. If one accepts that a common ancestry connects humans with non-human animals, and that we share a range of similarities as well as differences, it begs an examination of our treatment of them. When confining orcas, elephants, and chimpanzees in zoos and marine parks, we must ask whether we would treat a human with similar capabilities in the same way. So with that in mind, I'm going to address aspects of the nature of elephants, chimpanzees, and orcas that raise important questions about their captivity in zoos and marine parks. And then I'm going to talk about why zoos will not be holding them in the future based on an increased recognition of our shared natures and the indistinct lines between us. Orcas, chimpanzees, and elephants are all reported to be self-aware. Some individuals have passed the mirror test, which humans are not able to do till they're about 18 to 24 months of age. To function effectively in society, non-human animals need to have a high level of understanding of conspecifics, or empathy. This in turn requires a high level of intelligence and self-awareness, which in itself is often cited as a prerequisite for suffering. And that's from Jake Veazey's Concepts in the Care and Welfare of Captive Elephants. Self-awareness is a thread that runs through and amplifies the impact of the topics I'm going to next be discussing. Social complexity. High intelligence and social complexity are traits that we share with orcas, elephants, and chimpanzees. Their large brains allow them to cope with a complex social life and the challenges, choices, and the rewards that come with it. As we know, there is ample evidence to show that elephants and orcas in captivity are not living in social structures reflective of those found in the wild, with orcas subjected to some of the most impoverished conditions. These wonderful attributes of intelligence and social complexity, when limited by captivity, can become sources of suffering. Citing Vesey again, the intelligence of elephants may make them more capable of suffering, but their social complexities may make them more likely to suffer in zoos. But let's look at chimpanzees, for whom zoos have strived to create more natural social groups and enriched environments. Problem solved, right? Well, last year there was a study by Burkett and Newton Fisher that found that even though chimpanzees in zoos are showing natural behaviors, that there is also an endemic level of abnormal behavior. The authors suggest that even the best zoos are limited in what they can provide, both socially and through enrichment. So for elephants and orcas, whose demands are even greater and cannot be supported in a meaningful way due to the limitations of zoos and marine parks, it's an issue. Burkett and Newton Fisher also suggest that chimpanzee minds struggle to cope with conditions of captivity despite the best efforts of those charged with their care. They state that captivity itself causes behavioral abnormalities that can be seen as symptoms of mental illness if they were observed in human primates. This concept could be extrapolated to elephants and orcas as well. Elephants are all too commonly seen stereotyping in zoos, the repetitive swaying and head bobbing that we see. And recent studies have used psychology and neurobiology to plumb the depths of elephant psyches relative to traumas that we see in the work of Gay Bradshaw. The orca Tilikum, who killed a trainer at SeaWorld, is said to have suffered multiple traumas and social isolations that would have had a devastating psychological effect on him. In an article on the subject, Time magazine asked, "What made Tilikum snap?" So given our knowledge of their intelligence, sentience, and self-awareness, this raises the question of how we can knowingly subject these individuals to conditions that create mental disease and psychological suffering, something we would not knowingly do to humans. Animals denied choice and control over their surroundings suffer a reduction in welfare. In the wild, orcas, elephants, and chimpanzees are faced with decision-making processes that range from foraging choices to mates to varied habitats that cannot be matched in captivity. Captivity is the antithesis of choice. It is an environment in which these intelligent, non-human animals are highly managed, their feeding controlled and limited to a small fraction of the variety found in their natural diets, their choices of mates and companions made for them, their offspring and significant others are often taken from them, and their physical and social choices limited in an unchanging environment in which almost everything becomes predictable. The far simpler word for all this really is management. It's a practice that typically gives far more weight to zoo needs and resources than it does to the needs of non-human individuals. Zoos and marine parks could try and reduce the management aspect by designing facilities in such a way to promote choices in food, shelter, and social companions, but clearly there are limitations to the captive environment. And management practices such as separations through interfacility transfers disrupt families and social networks. Even now we recognize, so culture is the next area. Even now we recognize that free-ranging elephants, orcas, and chimpanzees possess culture, meaning that ways of life are not just transmitted genetically, but through systems of knowledge, communication, and social learning. We know that orcas maintain vocal dialects despite extensive associations with pods who have different dialects. Different chimpanzee groups show variation in a range of behaviors, including foraging and hunting, and elephants convey knowledge from generation to generation, and some imitate sounds that they then pass on to others. For humans, culture can be altered and eventually lost through the introduction of outside influences, whereas for non-human animals, in captivity, they've been so thoroughly removed from their natural social environments in which culture functions that their culture cannot be recovered. Can culture similar to that found in free-ranging species be recreated in the captive environment? I don't think so. No captive environment requires cooperation or group coordination for survival. Everything is provided for them, and they're not subject to challenges and natural pressures that often result in innovation and learning. Even if one were to argue that there could be a type of culture in zoos, management practices that disrupt social networks through interfacility transfers In the case of elephants and orcas, lack of multi-generational social structures and high rates of infant mortality would not allow for transmission of information to subsequent generations. And even if there were means of transmission, it would only need to pass along a dysfunctional cultural model. Sue Savage Rumbaugh, the director of the Great Ape Trust, writes of great apes, "The captive environment negates the possibilities of travel, kinship structure, roles within the group-based mental worlds, and constructs of cultural realities. However, as human beings, we know that it is precisely these types of mental processes that provide meaning for our human minds." So I present that 50 years, maybe a little bit more than 50 years from now, 50 to 75 years, that zoos and marine parks will no longer hold orcas, elephants, and chimpanzees for a variety of reasons. For elephants and orcas, it'll likely be the enormity of their physical, social, and psychological needs and the problems that the limitations of captivity create for them. But this also will require recognition of the depths of their intelligence, emotions, and capacity for suffering in order to negate justifications for confining them. Other species will follow them, such as the bottlenose dolphin, though that's going to take a bit longer. For chimpanzees, it will be a bit of a different story. I believe in the next 50 years, we're going to see a chimpanzee attain legal personhood. And this will be based on the depth of our shared attributes, of course, and on our DNA. Naturally, the question will arise of how we can confine a chimpanzee person when that individual has done nothing to deserve confinement. I expect that other members of the great ape family will follow the chimpanzee, if not as legal persons, then as objects of questions about captivity and display. Already there are indicators that our society is changing its view of non-human animals. Today, companion animals become so important in our lives that they become the subject of wills and trusts. Family courts are giving serious weight to the custody of four-legged family members in divorce proceedings. And there are state statutes that allow a judge to include non-human animals in protective orders in divorce and domestic violence cases. And as I stated, I'll speed through it. As I stated before, it's only a matter of time before chimpanzees are granted legal personhood, which is sure to create a cultural tsunami in which society will be forced to re-examine its ethics where the interests of non-human animals are concerned. The other things, I'm going to speed through this. Scientific knowledge, of course, is going to continue to make advances. And as we see today, these type of discoveries are very much of interest to the general public. And of course, there's the developing multidisciplinary field of anthrozoology that I also believe is going to lead the way in examining the realities of non-human animals and re-examining our relationships with them. Oops, sorry, I missed that one. Public perception and opinion is also going to play a large role. In fact, what makes, for example, what makes chimpanzees so popular is that we see so much of ourselves in them, family bonds, emotion, and communication, and our shared, of course, 99% of our DNA. In addition, we are becoming increasingly aware of the similarities that we share even with physically dissimilar non-humans, such as orcas and elephants. In the future, what attracted us to these non-humans, I believe, will become the basis for making the decision to no longer confine them. I imagine that even today, people may question how we can confine orangutans after giving them iPads to communicate with individuals via Skype and other zoos, including their separated offspring. Philosopher James Rachels, in discussing Darwin's work, stated, "The fundamental reality is best represented by saying that the earth is populated by individuals who resemble one another and who differ from one another in myriad ways, rather than by saying that the earth is populated by different kinds of beings. In the future, the Darwinian blurring of the lines between species, between us and them, will become increasingly apparent. It will be up to us to seek a higher level of consciousness along with a good dose of empathy when considering the realities of non-human animals' lives, including those individuals held in captivity. For elephants, chimpanzees, and orcas, the limitations of zoos and marine parks are not just challenging, they are inappropriate for individuals who possess high intelligence, social complexity, profound psychological depth, self-awareness, and cultural transmission. We are steadily marching toward a different view of non-human animals, one that recognizes and values their inherent natures. I offer that in the future, the zoo industry will embrace this worldview as it is essential to the survival of non-human species on our planet, and this will change the future selection of species in zoos. Thank you.